Good evening and welcome to the painting program. This is the 10th in our series called Traces of Place. And for you people who haven't been watching, what the theme of this show is about is how each person that we've interviewed, we look through their work and talk to them about how their place of origin and the place that they live in comes to filter through into their work. And tonight in the studio I have with me Bonney from the Tweed Valley in northern New South Wales. Welcome to the program, Bonney.
Hi.
Now, Bonney was trained in Melbourne. From 1975 to 1977, she went to the Phillip Institute, which was Preston in those days. But before then, she was trained as a social worker. And it wasn't until she was in her late 20s that she actually became convinced that art was going to be the way that she was going to follow. Is that right, Bonney?
Well, it was actually later than that. It took quite a few years, but that was it was in my late 20s that I was encouraged to actually first try something out. I'd always been very interested in art and followed it, but I'd sort of lived it vicariously, I think, through other people. So that was really the beginning of my first experience at trying my hand at something.
Now, when you were trained as a social worker, you travelled after that and spent some time in London. We actually took up an adult education course you enrolled in ceramics because you had such lack of self-esteem. You thought, well, ceramics might be the easiest. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
But what happened was the course was full.
Exactly.
And you were moved into the sculpture.
So, yes, which is what I actually really wanted to do. But
right.
Was too afraid to try, I guess.
And enjoyed that immensely. How long did you do that for?
I did it for 2 years. The first year I did it in clay modelling, and then the second year I did, with the same teacher, I moved into stone carving. But what was interesting to me about it was that I very, very rapidly found that I had a facility for it, and that was my first really major, that started to change my whole perception of myself, really. And
your own creativity. Let's move on to the slides anyway and have a look at Bonney's paintings. The first one that she did in 1976 called Still Life on Neen Street. Now, Bonney's best known as a painter. She's just finished a solo exhibition in Melbourne. But this painting would have been done, well, it's actually oil pastel, that would have been done while you were at college still, is that right?
That's right, yes. I did a lot of work of this ilk. I've only selected one because I wasn't very good at photographing my work in those days, and they were all askew.
But not a particularly large work, 14 inches by 19 inches. And you're using objects on the table, domestic situation, and Neen Street was where you lived at the time?
Yes, yes.
And that was in Melbourne?
Yes.
Right.
And all the works I did probably for the first, at least couple of years at art school were either still lifes or interiors. They were all domestic, related to my domestic situation.
Yet the objects have a kind of a symbolic value even at that level, at 1976. The distortion of the teapot, the distortion of the slice of watermelon with its individually cast shadow seems to have a kind of a psychological presence beyond just an object.
Well, I think that was the that was the best I could draw. I was trying very hard to make it look, to me that looked exactly as it was.
Right.
It was just a sort of, I guess that's the way my vision has always been.
And that's come to be a strength in your more gradually as your work has developed. You've used that as a strength.
Well, I think other people always saw it as a strength. I always thought they were just rather odd drawings and didn't perceive it as being anything of particular interest. It took me a long time before I started to appreciate that value in it.
And see the merit. Let's move on to the next slide, which is called Broken Dreams. So already you're moving in, this is only finished in 1977, a year after the one before, but you're moving into a far more metaphorical statement. Would that be a term you'd accept?
Yes, that was. I included this work in the slides because it was a seminal work for me, because it was the first time that I had actually made a work that wasn't to do with still lifes or interiors or actual objects that were in front of me, and it arose out of a broken relationship that I had, and I was very disturbed by it at the time, and it was actually a kind of a therapy for me, and I got myself through a difficult period in my life by actually drawing, and so it was very exciting. It was very exciting to me because suddenly here was something quite different. and it was the first of many of that ilk.
Yes, last week we had Helen Fuller on the program, Helen Lillicrap Fuller, and she was talking about the same process of catharsis, where you take the shards from your life and you remake them. And certainly for this particular work that we've just been looking at, that would be the case. You're working through a situation that was difficult, and it becomes a source of quite a strong work. We'll move on to the next one, which is a portrait done in 1977, again in oil pastel. Portrait of?
Well, that's a friend of mine called Dure Dara. She's actually the lady friend of one of my very, the main mentor in my years at Preston Institute, an artist called David Tolley. And this was actually, he was my drawing teacher, and I did figure drawing and then portrait drawing with him. So this was actually done in a, as a student in class. And
looking back on it now, do you recognise it as being a strong work?
Yes, I do.
And what is it that's strong for you in this work still?
Well, I guess it's got very high colour contrast, and it's got that odd distortion about it that makes it really interesting to me. But at the time, it is very, the resemblance between of the person is actually very strong to me. It speaks very much of her. She's an Indian woman.
Well, it does have a strong presence, and it's often difficult to pinpoint just what it is in a drawing or a painting that gives it that presence.
Well, there's something really odd about around the shoulders, isn't there? And the arms, it's constricted, so it's got a slightly totemic or sort of a doll-like or voodoo, almost a voodoo kind of quality, which I guess is not inappropriate, because I suppose it's a kind of an unconscious reference to her cultural origins somehow.
Let's move on to the next slide, which is "And I Dream of the Tropics." Bonney's done this particular mixed media piece in 1979, and it seems to me to evoke a lot of what the more recent stuff that we'll be looking at later on in the show is about. Now, Bonney, tell us what was happening, what was on your mind when you did this particular work?
At this point in time, I was living with my partner just outside of Melbourne in a rural area, and we had already decided that we wanted to move to the tropics or somewhere much far north. So this was a sort of a fantasy, if you like, about this move that I was very excited about. So I've used ferns, and sort of the image on the right are like those, actually I don't know what they're called, but some of the aloe vera family, very strong, thick, because I always think of the tropics as having very lush, verdant and succulent and larger than life kind of imagery.
And that's a self-image?
Yes, it's a sort of self-portrait. I mean, my concern in self-portraits is never really for likeness.
It's more a
My concern is never for likeness, it's really for psychological interpretation or a feeling state.
Right. And having said that, let's look at the next one, which is again a 1979 drawing called The Fountainhead.
That's another type of self-portrait. Again, you can see the image of the palm tree on the left, which is again to do with tropics, but in this one it's got that sort of a deserty feeling in the background, and the black pyramids, which is reference really to my cultural origins, which is Semitic. I'm Jewish by culture, and so I think of that as, that's why I called it The Fountainhead. It's really to do with origins in the past and Egypt or the Middle East or so on. But it's interesting because the image of the pyramid, as you'll see later, has recurred in my work quite recently.
Certainly the theme that we're dealing with for the Flying Art School this year is called Traces of Place, and a lot of people are looking back at their origins, their psychological origins, as well as their family backgrounds, and traces of things that have come through their drawings, sometimes unknown to them at first, and then they see that once they recognise them, they start recurring all the more. Let's look back at the slides again at Sexuality Drawing 1, which has been done in 1979. Again in soft pastel. You work a lot in soft pastel.
I did. Nearly all of my works until the last 2 or so years were works on paper, mixtures of pastel, oil crayon, mixed media, but a lot of oil crayon and a lot of pastel in the past.
So you've got that little figure dancing in almost like a little womb-like structure.
This was one of a series of, I think there were 4 in the original series, that were a bit, they were kind of a description of states that were to do with sexuality. This one was the first of them, and I think the most successful. And it was a kind of depicting a sort of a feeling of an ecstasy state, really. You can see all the funny sort of enlargement around the womb, and
right,
and then the fact that the whole thing is enveloped in a womb shape. And then there's a hand on the right-hand side. That's it's a bit hard to see there because the hand's very dark, but on the right that's a hand reaching in, which I suppose is a kind of a birth.
I was wondering if the hand was
somehow
beckoning or threatening. To me, it's like a beckoning.
Yes, I think it's the picture to me didn't ever have a feeling of threatening. Some of the others did. Some of the subsequent ones talked about sexual tension, and they had they were all enclosed in some kind of a womb shape, but some of the subsequent ones had barbed edges to them and things. But this was a rejoicing. And
the lovely yellow tongue-like flames coming off the body. And the next slide is Anguish and the Delicate Dream, done in 1982. Now that's got far more of a tension to it, or a different mood anyway.
Yes, that was another one that arose out of again concerned with relationships. This was in my difficult period in my current partnership, so to speak, and again I found it was a short but difficult period, but I found that I helped myself through it very much by making works which were talking about my feelings at the time. You can't see clearly, but the little image on the top right, it's little hands, it's two blue hands, and then the image inside that is actually, if I remember correctly, there's I think a male and a female face in there. We'll
move on to the next slide, which is Through Chasms Measureless to Man. Is that a reference to, is it Coleridge's poem Xanadu?
The title is, but that was given afterwards, and in fact was offered to me by somebody else, so to speak. That's a larger piece. That was about, what would it be? Maybe 2.5 foot by 3.5 foot, roughly. And it was a mixed media collage, one of a whole series I did over a period of 18 months or 2 years. And the starting point, it's indiscernible in the slide, but the starting point to all these works was photographic images that I'd cut out of glossy magazines which concerned, they were all to do with geology somehow or other. They were mountains and volcanoes and chasms and formation of amber and things like that. And I actually cut out little areas from the glossy magazine and then reworked that surface and then threw that down on the paper, a bit like the way Helen Lillicrap was talking, and then just use that as a central starting point. So the very centre of that work is actually a reworked image of a chasm or a canyon.
I see.
And then I've sort of worked out from the centre outwards.
The end product is a far more abstract feeling to it than the previous works that we've been looking at. But again, this thing of chasms, of states of being, that the psychological feeling in your work, I think, runs through from the figurative work to the much more abstract work. But let's have a look at the next thing, which is Gardens of the Deep 2, an image that was done in 1985.
Well, that's towards the tail end of that same series of collages, and again, you can see there's actually a square or a rectangle within a rectangle within a rectangle. There's 3, and the very innermost little segment, which is a bit hard to discern, again is the reworked photographic image, and then the next rectangle out, you can see that was, I worked that whole sheet, and then when I'd finished that I decided I'd make it even bigger, so I put that onto a still larger sheet. That work incorporated all sorts of other, aside from bits of hand-coloured papers and so on, I also incorporated bits of satins and silks and maybe even little bits of gold and silver paper and things like that. So again, I was sort of drawing on some domestic materials, yes.
And that thing of, those of the viewers who'd be familiar with Judy Chicago, that thing of working in and in and in into an orifice-like shape, which relates back to the image that we saw before. But also using stitchery as part of a woman's heritage of making works of art. I did actually use stitchery. I used a sewing machine on some of that series, and actually and used fabrics and hand stitching and
and machine stitching as well.
Interesting. The next slide is of the Sphinx, so we're going back to that thing of origins again. But it's at Mount Burrell, is that right?
Yes, this is, I hadn't thought of it as the connection with the origins. This is one of quite a large series of small oil crayon drawings I did, which were depicting my very immediate surrounding. Where I live, I'm in a valley surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, and so I did quite a large series that were mountainscapes of each of the 3 mountains. I think the next slide depicts Mount Warning, which is another one. And then at the same time I did a series, which I haven't represented here, of what I called gardenscapes, which were little close-up visions of areas of the garden in it, semi-abstracted.
So you're doing these outside in the open?
Yes, sitting on my verandas actually, looking out. So this is Mount Warning, which is a mountain, the ancient volcano, which a lot of people would have heard of. And I'm looking through the tree on the left is the mango tree, which is a kind of very domestic reference because the mango tree is just outside my immediate garden.
So it's framing the object in the background in a literal way as well as a metaphorical way, that thing of bringing home to you, that thing which is almost too far to touch, if you like. Let's move on to the next slide. It's just an untitled slide, but this is moving into the next series of work, isn't it, Bonney?
Yes, it is. It's preliminary. Actually, so were the prior two. The prior two were the more realistic and first representations, and then it went on to a body of work that was more like this. This is a small work. At this stage I was getting very interested in really learning about oils, because most of my work, as I said, had been on paper, and I was preparing for an exhibition that I was to have in Melbourne, and I really wanted to I've always loved oils, but I had never done them enough to master, to have any sense of mastery. So I started doing oil work on paper, and in fact I was using my hands and fingers a lot, and so this was a kind of a finger painting. It's only a small work, about 2 foot by 1 foot maybe, and you can see the little parrots. And I got very interested in the way the banana trees and the palms and things that I'd planted in my garden, which, you know, by this stage were mature. Sort of every time I'd sit on the ground and look out, and somehow I always had this sense that they were dissecting the picture plane, dissecting my area of vision. So that has become a very recurring theme, and the semicircular shapes have also become a recurring theme. They were actually inspired by the North Queensland fan palm, which I first discovered a couple of years ago when I went to North Queensland for the first time, and that's recurred through almost all of the work since.
Let's have a look at the next slide called After Image. That's Matilda in the garden, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, Garden Dancer. That's a tremendously energetic painting, not a large painting. But again, that thing of the energy of growth bursting through the female figure, as well as the plants in the background. And this thing is a recurring theme for you, this dance in the garden.
Yes, that was actually the title of the recent show that I had, The Garden and the Dance.
And the paint just almost primitively applied, no head to the female figure. And the dog, when I first saw this particular work, the dog was a formidable presence, but I don't see it that way anymore. No,
that dog actually is one of the dogs that I have, and at the time that I made this work, I did a whole series of work in which she kept recurring, and she was in whelp at the time, and I got somehow very symbolically involved with this whole, because I have such a keen interest in the whole process of birth and death and life and regeneration. Her being pregnant somehow stirred that in me, so she kept just popping up in all the pictures. And the dance, of course, well, the garden. I mean, it is a metaphor. But there are a lot of references to dance and to music through my work, because they're both things that they're sort of well, they're like muses to me, really. I listen to music all the time when I'm working, and I do a dance class, and so I'm very...
do you?
Yes.
Let's move on to the next slide, which is After Image. It's on rice paper. It's a very delicate work, very different to the images we've just seen, far more delicately applied.
Yes, I did. This is one of a series of about 20 works on paper, but all on rice paper, all the same size, that I was actually doing more or less simultaneously to making the oil paintings. And it's interesting because the imagery is still the same. I mean, there's still the dissecting tree trunks, and there's still the image of the fan palm and the energy marks, but the end product is quite different because the process was quite different. The starting points for a lot of these work were actually some wood blocks, large wood blocks. These works are about approximately 2 foot square, and I made a series of 4 big wood blocks and printed them up in black and white, and then threw them all away because I just didn't feel happy with them technically.
Right.
They went back into my paper drawer with the thought that maybe I'd reuse them at some stage, and that's exactly what I've done. I've pulled them out later. And
the next slide is Moon Shadow, done in 1988, which again is a reworked woodblock print.
Yeah.
And it's on oriental paper, but you've worked on it with pastel. What kind of pastel?
Well, they're all just soft pastels, except for I think the black is too, actually. The black's probably compressed charcoal because it gives a very dense and very rich black. So of that body of work, some of them have got that more pastel-y surface, and some of them have got a lot more of the watercolour showing because there's watercolour underneath them.
Yes, they're very different to see in the flesh, as the viewers would appreciate. The subtlety of the application of the different media has got so much presence. And in the next slide, called Floating Mist Deep, there's another example of the woodcuts that have been reworked.
Yes, this one actually, they weren't actually all reworked. Some of what happened was, because I was working on the fine, very thin, fine rice paper, whenever I applied the watercolour, little bits of it would bleed through onto my working table, and likewise I was using oil crayons, those big oil sticks on some of them, and then I used a hot iron over it because I didn't really want the oil to sit up on the surface of the paper. I wanted everything to be
into the fibre of the
paper. And I found when I put the hot iron over dense areas of it, little bits of that would bleed through. So I got the idea to work in layers of paper. And I started working on one piece with a blank sheet of rice paper underneath to catch the random markings, so to speak. And then I would use that as a starting point for the next work.
The basis for the next one.
And this is an example of that derivative, the sort of second layer down, so to speak, which became a bit looser and a bit more abstract again.
So it literally is the painting directing the flow of the next series of work, of the next painting. Now we'll move on to your most recent work, which has just been on show down in Melbourne. And this slide is called Garden Dancer, Panel 1 Triptych, is that right?
Yes, that's the left. There's 3 panels. They're about roughly a metre square each.
Now you're moving on to a much larger scale with some of these works.
Yes, well that work ended up being 1 metre by 3 metres approximately. And again, you can see there's the image of the dog. You can just see in the right bottom corner the snout of the dog, and then that followed on to the next panel, of course.
And the image behind the female figure, what's that?
Well, that's a strange... I've got this funny little corner in my garden, which is I don't know what you call it. It's got a metal framework that I've used to grow lovely vines over. What do you call it? Well, it's a curved shaped thing, and it's funny. I always have this... I look at it and it transports me right back to my childhood. It has a feeling of some sort of secret place about it. So
like a bower, a secret bower.
It's a bower, that's the word, yes. And it's recurred in a lot of works. One of them I simply entitled A Secret Place in the Garden. It's always somehow suggested something of mystery and unknown. I suppose it's a bit of a female image too. It's your eye has to look in and follow through.
Like the chasm ones and the other images you've used of those recesses.
Yes.
Right, we'll move on to the next slide from that same show that you've just had in Melbourne, and this is an untitled work, but it's obvious that it's come from the landscape. Well,
actually, I'm sorry I don't have one. I couldn't manage photographing it. It was so big. That's actually the 3rd panel of the same work we've just looked at.
Ah, right.
The 2nd panel goes on to the dog, and then this is the last panel. And yes, that's again the mountains that surround me, and
we'll move on to the next slide then. And these are oil paints.
These are all oils. This is the one that I actually changed the title, but that was the one I just referred to that was originally referred to as The Secret Place in the Garden. And you can see again that same, on the right-hand side, that same bower shape.
Yes. It, to me, is has a looming type of a presence. It's I haven't seen this particular work in the flesh, so it seems to me a very three-dimensional form there. Now, these particular works seem to play heavily on pattern. Are you influenced by, say, for example, Islamic art or works from Asian cultures which place a great emphasis on pattern?
I was always very attracted, long before I started painting, I was very attracted to the work of people like Matisse, who was very interested in pattern, as you know. But I have spent a lot of time travelling in Asia and India and Africa, and I suppose that might have probably has influenced it in some way, yes. And I think in the earlier works, such as the first couple that we saw, of the sort of psychological landscape, so to speak, I often there found that I used a series of little images that somehow were all separate and put it together in one work, and that to me, in retrospect, always seemed somehow reminiscent of Indian or Persian miniatures, or you know how they have...
Yes. Cut up the different spatial areas so that you read them two-dimensionally as well as three-dimensionally.
Yes, but I'm not really conscious of that carrying on into my work now, but I think there is a lot of... there are patternistic elements right through it.
But that has come mainly from your own position, that the garden and the way that you said the garden itself has broken into the landscape beyond that, and the way you situate the figure within that particular situation.
Yes.
Let's move on to the next slide anyway and have a look at some more of these images from that last show. This one is far more largely broken areas. There's not as much fineness. It's not as... It seems to be more broadly broken up treatment.
This was the first, after that series of rice paper works, that influenced the oil paintings, because I started actually using the wood blocks, the 2-foot square wood blocks, as a starting point for the paintings. I would just put some marks inked up from the wood block onto the blank canvas as a kind of a trigger starting point. And what actually unfolded from that was that, as you'll see through these last paintings, there's a sort of more formal quality that's come into them.
Right, so we'll have a look at the next slide, and that's very different again, and you've got the pyramid shape coming back into it.
Yes, well in the previous painting, the mountain in the previous painting, which had become abstracted, somehow turned into a pyramid, and I introduced this sort of broken artificial horizon which follows through most of the rest of this series.
How big is that painting, Bonney?
That's about 4 foot by 6 foot, as are all the rest of them.
We'll have a look at the next slide. That's from the catalogue of the exhibition.
Yes, that's a bit smaller. That's about roughly a metre square.
So they're grown up in scale, certainly. And the next slide. So again, you've got these recurring themes of past and present, of your garden and your origins in the background, which are reminiscent of the Egyptian
Yes, and
pyramid.
that sort of washed out desert areas. That started as an accident, a correction of an accidental mistake that I wanted to scrub out, so to speak, and then I just got very interested in it. There's also some sort of futuristic references in that funny little, there's a sort of planet Earth on the left, and then there's
almost like little mirror dancing shapes, dancing floating shapes.
Yes.
And the division of the picture plane. It is very much that past and present thing when you see your work. Now we'll move on to the next slide. Is this the last in this series?
It's the second last.
Right.
Well, the third last, but it's the second last that I've got slides of here. That one was called Eclipse, and I was interested in the... do you remember when we had an eclipse a few years ago?
Yes.
It was very extraordinary in the country because the bird song stopped, everything went dead quiet as the day suddenly became night and then started up again, and it left a really indelible impression on me. So I was interested in that sort of juxtaposition of day and night.
And that edge of day and night. We'll move on to the final slide of this series because the program's just drawing to a close. And again, that energy, that growth coming through, and I think the viewers would have picked up on the themes that are running right through Bonney's work, which the artist is never aware of until you look at, in retrospect, that thing I think that Kandinsky said, that the artist is aware of all, but only after the artwork.
Yes.
But Bonney, thank you very much for coming into the studio with us tonight.
Thank you.
And I'm sure if the viewers have enjoyed it as much as I have, we'll have requests for more later on. Thank you, Bonney.
Thank you.
Good night. And good night to you. See you next week.